University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1964 and a master's in 1968, and at the University of California, Davis, where he earned his PhD in 1975. We got another round of applause. Although he served 2 years in the United States Army, his foreign service consists mainly of living 13 years in College Station, Texas, which we will allow for him, where he taught in the history department at Texas A&M from 1977 to 1990. In the latter years of teaching, he had the good fortune to be appointed Merrick Professor of Western American History at the University of Oklahoma. At OU, he taught courses on the United States Geological Survey, American Environmental History, and the history of the American West until his retirement in 1990, although I did find out before that he hasn't officially retired because he went to a dissertation this past week. Over those 2 decades, he directed the work of 15 PhD students, many master's students, and lectured thousands of mostly eager undergraduates. After retirement, he moved to Reno, where the sun always shines, the air is dry, and there are neither tornadoes nor a state income tax. Professor Pisani has been president of the American Society for Environmental History and the Agricultural History Society, and he is the author of 4 books and 40 articles and book chapters on the history of natural resources used in the West. His most recent book is Water and American Government, the Reclamation Bureau National Water Policy in the West, published by the University of California Press. Please join me in welcoming my friend Don to the stage.
Oh, okay. It was already up. Well, thank all of you for being here, and thank Jim for the very nice introduction. I hope I can live up to some of the hype. I was thinking that if I was really that good, I'd be able to tell you something profound like whether Blake Bell will work out at tight end next year. And if you don't know who Blake Bell is, it won't be on the test, so don't worry about that. He's a football player at the University of Oklahoma. I've maintained, despite from my new home in Reno, Nevada, I have maintained my interest in the Sooners and watch every one of their games, so. I knew there'd be some of you here, and I know there's some Oklahoma State people too, and I have nothing against Oklahoma State. In fact, I like them. After all, one of our coaches is the brother of your coach, so. Over there is the Pacific, windows on the Pacific, and most of these pictures are of the arid West. Let me open my talk today by introducing, this is not Blake Bell, as some of you have surmised. This is Walter Prescott Webb, one of the great historians of the American West, I think, and a man familiar to some of you. He was born in Carthage, Texas, on the eastern edge of that state, not far from Shreveport. And Webb was a poor boy made good. Today, the Carthage town website advertises the town as, quote, the best small town in Texas and country at its best. But in the early years of the 20th century, farm life in and around Carthage was no picnic. Webb grew up so poor that he had to rely on financial assistance from a neighbor to attend the University of Texas. He did not begin college until he was 21, and he did not receive his bachelor's degree until he was 27 in 1915. And I often would tell dilatory young undergraduates the story of Webb. Graduated at 27. It took him another 5 years to finish his MA degree, and he wrote a thesis on the Texas Rangers, famous book. His professors at UT then thought Walter Prescott Webb was ready for the big time, and they sent him off for a PhD degree to the University of Chicago, which in those days had a reputation comparable to Harvard and Yale, at least for PhD work in history. But Webb lasted only 1 year in Chicago. He was homesick, felt out of place, failed his PhD exams, returned to Texas, and stayed there for the rest of his career. He became a fixture at the University of Texas and became the best-known historian of the American West after Frederick Jackson Turner. This is the cover of his book, The Great Plains. His writings had a similarity to Frederick Jackson Turner that many of you have heard of. Both emphasized the relationship between economic, political, and social history. Both claimed that the American frontier had forged American institutions, character, and values. And both were environmental determinists. And there's no better example of environmental determinism than Webb's book, The Great Plains, which was published long ago in 1931. According to Webb, several facts of nature made the Great Plains different from other parts of the country. Notably, the absence of trees, the vast grasslands, and west of the 100th meridian, the relative absence of water. Settlers who took up land on the plains left lush forests behind, along with a climate in which too much water was more of a problem than too little. They entered an endless sea of grass, but technology helped them to adapt. The scarcity and cost of lumber forced settlers to string barbed wire fences and erect houses made of prairie sod, said Webb. The limited water supply led to the use of windmills and such agricultural innovations as irrigation and dry farming. The absence of navigable streams promoted railroads as a replacement for riverboats. The relative flatness of the plains and the absence of tree stumps encouraged agricultural mass production using farm machinery never dreamed of in the East. But not all the changes were technological. For example, in many parts of the West, forage crops such as hay and alfalfa replaced the wheat, corn, and cotton of agricultural regimes, staple crops in the East and South. In Webb's mind, the fact that in much of the West it didn't rain from May through September or October, that western streams carried less water, and that their volume varied dramatically from winter to summer and from year to year made irrigation an inevitable part of agriculture. And since few western streams were navigable, the allocation of water became a state, not a federal responsibility, which Webb thought was a very good idea. In the eastern United States, as a legacy of the English common law, those who owned land along a stream had the right to use that stream's water for domestic purposes, to water livestock, to power mills, or for that matter, to irrigate crops. But that right was not absolute. Riparian owners, riverbank owners shared the stream with each other, and they could divert water from the bed of the stream only at the sufferance of their neighbors whose property also abutted the water. There were no individual rights then to water under the riparian regime, only a pool of rights. The rights did not depend on use, nor could they be forfeited. Now what we have here, this shows what he thought was a dramatic difference between crops east and west. Actually, if you look up at the top of the Great Plains, you know, winter wheat, Montana becomes a winter wheat zone. And so let me move on to this, which I think is a better illustration of his determinism. If you can read that, you'll find that over there, east of the 100th, or what does he has at the 98th meridian, but east of that, you'll find that's the humid zone, followed the English common law, riparian rights. Region 2, modified, and again, environmental determinism. The drier it is, the more likely you are to move to the prior appropriation regime, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So you can look out there on the West Coast, and that is a mixed regime. We'll talk about that in just a minute. That is to say, riparian rights coexist with prior appropriation. In Zone 3, that's the driest part of the West, including Nevada, where I live now, and that is all prior appropriation, following the so-called Colorado Doctrine. Now, riparian rights suited humid climates, according to Webb, but not the West, where there would never be enough water for all. And aridity and semi-aridity dictated some form of water rationing, and the fairest method, he thought, was first come, first serve. Prior appropriation, as this system came to be called, sanctioned individual as opposed to interdependent rights, individual rights as opposed to collective rights. And put simply, the first person to divert water from a stream and put it to a beneficial use, which irrigating crops is a very good example, could use as much water as he or she needed, even if the water diversion dried up the entire river. The water did not have to be used on the land adjoining the water, or even within the same watershed. If any water remained in the stream after the first diverter began to use water, others could use it too. But once the stream was fully appropriated, that was it. Those who came after didn't have any chance at water. The catch was that, of course, the volume of streams is not steady from year to year as rainfall is, and as Jim showed us. And therefore, some water users had rights only in certain months or in very wet years, while the first user always had the strongest claim. These rights, of course, could be bought and sold. Now, Webb's book is a triumph of the imagination, as Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 frontier thesis is. Its scope was breathtaking, and in 1939, the Social Science Research Council proclaimed it the most significant work of United States history published since World War I, in the 20 years before World War II, in other words. The Webb thesis, as it came to be called, was enormously popular among general readers. But it was a set of propositions rather than a sustained historical narrative or analysis. It suggested that prior appropriation, this diversion of water, this making water an individual property right, it suggested prior appropriation was a simple, logical, and efficient way to allocate a scarce resource. But the analysis ignored several facts that historians have emphasized in recent years. First, nature never dictates history. It influences history, but certainly doesn't dictate history on its own. Human beings are not blank slates. They are not passive. And the past is always in a dialogue with the present. And tradition always mediates innovation. When human beings enter new environments, They carry attitudes and values with them. Second, prior appropriation was adopted not because it was efficient, but because it was simple, and because it did not require a massive and expensive bureaucracy to administer. It was, in short, consistent with the American preference for small government. Finally, prior appropriation triumphed because it produced the greatest wealth in the shortest period of time for mining, land, and water companies, not because individual miners favored it, and certainly not because it suited irrigation agriculture. So let's take a look at the origins of water law in the West, a different view than Webb had. The first lesson that I would try to emphasize today: in the West, prior appropriation resulted from American conceptions of limited government and home rule. Limited government, home rule. Now, Webb acknowledged that prior appropriation originated in the mining camps of California in the 1840s and 1850s. Oddly enough, the Great Plains had nothing to do with it. And agriculture didn't have anything to do with it initially. After all, the first wave of white miners to enter the Great Plains arrived during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, not the 1840s and 1850s. Webb did not acknowledge that prior appropriation also had many antecedents and precedents that originated outside the West. It was not just a product of the aridity of the West. In the first decades of the 19th century, for example, New England textile mills, the first big businesses or factory business of the United States, impounded water, built dams along streams in New England, and used that water as a motive force to drive the looms and other textile machines in the cotton factories that were established right before and after the War of 1812. The law changed to meet new economic circumstances in the East as it would later in the West. The prime difference being the first phase of the prime change being the first phase of industrialization in the United States. Now, another point that I think is very important to remember, the home rule point that I mentioned just a bit ago. On the frontiers, it didn't matter whether it was Kentucky, Ohio, or Illinois, settlers made their own laws. When the pace, long before the mining camps of California, when the pace of settlement outran the federal surveyors on government land, settlers took the law into their own hands. They formed claims clubs, associations, and even granted to each other rights to land. These rights could be bought and sold, and the first on the scene got the best land. So these claims clubs set a precedent for the mining camps of California where prior appropriation originates. Both took property that belonged to the nation, meaning all the citizens of the United States, and arrogated it to themselves. They did so in part because they were pioneers conquering the wilderness, but also because they deeply believed that crops, houses, barns, fences, and roads were what gave land its value. This was the so-called labor theory of value, the notion that the worth of a natural resource came from its use and improvement, not so much from an intrinsic value or a paper right. And incidentally, the book I'm working on now is about squatters in the major cities of California, and it deals with the same conception of possessory rights, meaning your right to the land you hold is mainly a right of occupation, not the paper title, and all the complications that involved, including squatter riots in the streets of San Francisco and Sacramento. Now, another point that I want to emphasize, people often forget that the size and structure of the United States government in the mid-19th century was very important in terms of what institutions we developed to administer and allocate natural resources. So let me just mention a couple points. In 1850, the federal budget of the United States was less than $50 million. It had shot up from about $30 million in the early 1840s. There was no federal income tax, no central bank, and only a minuscule Army and Navy. In the decades after the Civil War, the National Army of the United States averaged about 25,000. I was thinking about this when, of course, the whole debate over that the Army is going to return to the Army of pre-World War II size. Well, in the 1930s, the Army of the United States was something like the 15th or 18th in the world in size. That's a tradition of the United States, not to have a large standing army. Well, this was a small federal government, but a profligate one, another way of looking at it. It gave away land, forests, water, gold, and silver, in part because it was too weak to rent or lease those resources, which in theory, I emphasize again, belonged to the entire nation. From 1820 to the Civil War, most of the land in the United States sold for $1.25 an acre, but even that was too much for people on the frontier. And so after 1862, after the South left the Union, you get the Homestead Act, which of course gave the land away for nothing other than a filing fee. And another point that I would raise here is it was always recognized that the federal government had a stake in the natural resource, particularly the precious metals and even base metals like copper and lead. The original 13 colonies had charters that reserved 20% of all precious metals, the value of precious metals, to the crown, the English crown, and in 1785, to help pay the cost of the Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary Congress raised that to 1/3 of all gold, silver, lead, and copper found on government lands. Land belonged to the federal government. So by the time of the California Gold Rush, it's well established that the government should collect something for the use of these resources, the metals. Unfortunately, they had tried this before. And why this becomes important is if you ask the question, why didn't they do more to manage water? Why didn't the federal government take a more direct role? One answer is they had tried this before and it had not worked, or it had not worked as conceived. Many of you know, I think, that in the 19th century, the federal government adds one cabinet position in 1849. That was, anybody? 1849, the cabinet? Interior. And one other at the end of the century, agriculture. Only two over the whole scope of the 19th century. So this is a very stable, small government, we might say. Well, Congress first tries in 1807 to pass a law to lease mineral lands. It fails, and I'm not going to go into why that happens. It doesn't do so again until the 1820s. In the 1820s, it does so because all sorts of lead mines are opening up in the upper Mississippi Valley in the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. Who administers this program before 1849? It's actually the United States Army, and there is a lieutenant named Martin Thomas who is responsible for carrying out a policy of Congress, which is to lease mineral lands, and at one point even to sell lead, which of course had military value, to government smelters. Well, to cut to the chase, this law, there's a leasing program nominally in effect from 1824 to 1846. From 1841 to 1844, the government collected only $6,000 from lead miners who leased their land, and the cost of administering the system cost $26,000. So the cost of administration was 4 times what they collected. Now, so what? What does this have to do with prior appropriation? Well, I'm going to tell you. When gold is discovered in California in 1848, the inept attempt to regulate these lead mines is a very recent lesson that sticks in the mind of the military governor of California and other officials in California. Some of you may have heard of the military governor of California, Colonel Richard B. Mason, who rode to the mining camps in 1848, soon after gold was discovered at Coloma Mill, Sutter's Mill, about 50 miles east of Sacramento. And he reported back to Washington that there was so much gold in California. Remember, a war had just been completed with Mexico, the Mexican War in 1848. Colonel Mason reported back to Washington that the state contained enough gold to pay the cost of the Mexican War, quote, 100 times over. Well, he was right. But the problem was, how do you license miners? A very, very difficult problem. And he wrote back to Washington, he said, you know, I want to do this. And I think since this property, this gold and silver belongs to the United States government, we ought to regulate it. But his problem was that every time he took soldiers into the mining country with the expectation that they perhaps would administer this, they absconded, burned their uniforms, and became miners. There are no other policemen. This is California. The Army is all they had there. So eventually what they have to do in California is let these soldiers work at things, and you have people. William Tecumseh Sherman was in the business of banking in San Francisco while he was still in the United States Army. The same William Tecumseh Sherman that played such a big role in the Civil War. So my point here is that the notion that you would ever get a system out of California after the disastrous lead mining experience, an elaborate administrative system, was just fanciful. Now, lesson number 2, prior appropriation was always contested. It was never accepted as whole cloth, as Walter Prescott Webb suggested in The Great Plains. And now I want to show you a brief series of, what we used to quaintly call slides. Anybody who uses slides, you can tell, is an old duffer because of the obvious change in technology. Now, what am I trying to show you here? Number 1, you all recognize the miner with the pan, cradle, or sluice box. These were the miners who mined right along the edge of a stream. Okay, that's the first phase of mining. Crude tools, no diversion of water. But very soon they learned, well, number one, there was a lot of, let's see here. Down there in the channel of the bed, this is a diversion of a stream, and they're working the bed of the stream. Now, eventually what happens is another diversion. That's the first phase of things. Working the bed of a stream. Let's go back here. Now, this is critical. They reach a point where they've worked out the banks of the stream, which contain gold because streams go up and down, of course, in their volume. And they decide we have to seek out the gravels that are far removed. This begins the process of prior appropriation, and not all miners agree with it by any means. This is an aqueduct carrying water, and then eventually you get this. This is hydraulic mining. Sorry? Oh, you can? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. These are hydraulic mining hoses, and note that they have washed away a great deal of soil. Many of you know where that soil went. It went down into the Sacramento Valley. And what you have left here is, of course, imagine the scale of operations here. From this comes, of course, the mining stock exchange. The first California stock exchange is mainly mining stocks from hydraulic mines in California and the Comstock lode mines, the shaft mines in Nevada. This, you can conceive of the enormous environmental destruction here. This is a picture of Malakoff diggings, the largest hydraulic mining operation. This is a picture from 1953. So my point here is that prior appropriation, and this is what I'm going to talk about now, prior appropriation really grew out of this latter phase of mining. Other miners in the early phase, using those crude tools along a stream, wanted riparian rights. Prior appropriation then did not appear immediately in the California mining camps. The first to appear in the camps believed in the principles of equal opportunity and sharing the wealth, not maximizing the wealth as the hydraulic mining companies did. So let me give you an example from the ground up of Trinity County, California. Trinity, if you've ever been to California, you know, is way up in the north. Inland, the biggest city would be Eureka, perhaps over on the coast. Way up out of the Sacramento Valley into the Trinity Alps, the mountain range that crosses Northern California and effectively is a kind of break between California and Oregon. At the time of the California Gold Rush, it could only be reached by pack trains and not wagons. Gold is discovered there a few months after it's discovered at Coloma in January of 1848. A lot of miners come in 49 and 50, but the greatest number come in 1851 and 1852. Now, the first miners who come in, there are two tributaries of the Trinity River, the West Weaver River and the East Weaver. And as they come in, new miners, of course, because the first claims are where? Along the streams and these little tributaries of the Trinity River. So they are forced to move out from the stream bed and move inland sometimes only half a mile, sometimes a mile or two. This sets the stage for the first diversions of water. And of course, once they start to divert the water, and that's in 1853, in a particularly dry year, 51 and 52 were fairly wet, this is what causes the first great debates between miners over the nature of water law. Before the drought of 1853, a dentist from Wilmington, Delaware, named William Ware, W-A-R-E, built 3 diversion ditches out of the East and West Weaver rivers, these little tiny, really small streams that fed into the Trinity River. They were about 11 miles long collectively, and they cost $12,000 to build. And in the spring of 1853, he turns all the water of West Weaver Creek out of its natural bed, cutting off water to the miners who were downstream from his diversion on that creek. This causes, of course, raises some critical questions. First, when you built a ditch, did building the ditch itself, starting construction of the ditch, give you the right to water, or was it only when somebody used the water? Meaning, did the owner of the ditch hold the water right, or did the user of the water hold the water right? That was unclear at that time in 1853. Or another way of putting it, did the water right date from the time construction begins or construction ends on the ditch? Could somebody who diverted water use all the water, or did they have to leave at least some water in the stream for those who were working downstream? All of this was unclear. Now, what happened was there were attempts to reconcile these differences. The miners who mined along the stream banks of the West Weaver River and those who used water near present-day Weaverville, which was diverted in some cases half a mile to a mile or two. So who has the basic right? Well, in the grand American tradition, after you try the courts and don't succeed, there was no local court. The closest was in Shasta, which was probably 50 miles away. And remember, this is very rough country. So they try to get William Ware, the miners who were downstream from us diversion, and there were hundreds of them, try to get William Ware to give them some water, to allow some water to flow down the stream in this dry year. He refuses to do it. 120 of them take their pistols, axes, shovels, and they go up to his dam and they tear it down, and then they burn the flume from which he had part of his aqueduct to get the water over to his miners who he was selling water to. After all, that was his motive in all of this. There then begins the 9 ringleaders of this damage to William Ware's ditch system are jailed in a jail that's about 18, a log jail. It's about 18 by 20 feet. 9 people are jailed there. This creates then a kind of comic opera showdown during which hundreds of miners, according to a county history description, descend on the jail and insist, in a kind of act of mass civil disobedience, they insist on being jailed too, that they had participated in this destruction of William Ware's ditch system. The sheriff there's no place. I mean, an 18 by 20 log jail was pretty full with the 9 people. They try to use a local store. Finally, they're forced to set everyone free because they neither have the place to jail them, nor do they have the food to feed them. This is not a wealthy county. Remember, mining districts were all on federal land, and so the tax revenue was very low. Ware's opponents claim that in dry years, the miners closest to a stream should receive preference because much of the water diverted into diversion ditches, Ware's ditches, evaporated or seeped into the soil. So there was a great deal more waste of water by miners who mined a great distance from the stream than miners who mined right along the stream. One miner wrote to a local newspaper claiming that Ware had simply refused to negotiate with them, and that was because Ware had a conception that prior appropriation, the rights that he claimed, should generate the greatest individual wealth, whereas the miner's conception of wealth was that it should provide the best living to the largest number of miners. The case finally gets into the local district court. Miners petition the state legislature, miners along the river, miners away from the river. Well, in a nutshell, what finally happens to resolve the difference is the process of mining. They exhaust the minerals, the gold, along the stream bed, whereas, of course, the diversion, as Malakoff diggings, this image on the screen, that kind of mining exists in the 1860s, 1870s, right into the 1880s. So my point here is Ware won out in Trinity County, and he won out largely because of the fact, not so much that he had a more compelling legal doctrine, but the technology of mining changes, and the people who mined along streams use up that mining. Their claims are no longer valuable. As time passes, though, remember how much money it takes to bring water great distances, to build dams, ditches, and flumes. Eventually, large mining companies turned the kind of miners who had mined along a stream into employees of the company. That's why prior appropriation is accepted, not because there aren't a great many people who contested prior appropriation or thought this is not a good system. All right. The next point. Prior appropriation did not easily adapt to agriculture, and that's the next point that I want to make. It isn't until really the 1870s and 1880s in California or other parts of the West where the railroad opens up a lot of agricultural land, the rail line down the San Joaquin Valley in California where irrigation booms in the 1870s, is built starting in 1871-72, finally builds into Los Angeles in 1876, and so the whole San Joaquin Valley is opened to irrigation. This was always, and a point that people forget, this was contested in all sorts of states, in all sorts of courts, and there's a debate right into the 1880s or 1890s whether the West should use riparian rights or the West should use prior appropriation. So in 1903, as an example of this, Nebraska's Supreme Court proclaimed that, quote, "We doubt whether a more equitable starting point for a system of irrigation law may be found than riparian rights," meaning you're in a new realm now when you have agriculture Do you use the same system of law that grew up in these mining camps? Now on to a man who is another person who I think will be familiar to a lot of you, and that is John Wesley Powell. John Wesley Powell, I think, is a hero of many of us. Here you will see him. Note how he's bending over there. He lost his arm at the elbow at the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War. And in fact, some of the most interesting stories about Powell are how in 1869, when he became the first person to pass through the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River, how he scrambled up cliffs and had to be rescued a couple times, if you've ever read the explorations of the Colorado, because he would get into a position where he had but one arm, and he'd have to get men to lower a rope to him so he could move on. He also, of course, became head of the Bureau of Ethnography, was a specialist in Indians. He became head of the U.S. Geological Survey from 1881 to 1894. And in the late 1880s, John Wesley Powell surveyed the reservoir sites and water supply of the American West for the first time. This is the first time data is collected. Imagine this. Hoover Dam is built in the 1930s. The data on which Hoover Dam, the water supply of the Colorado River, was based didn't start until the 1890s. Shows the conceit or arrogance of human beings that you could use this short period of time to measure effectively measure how much water the Colorado River carried over centuries. So Powell collects this stream data, and what he discovers is there's not enough water in the West to really develop the region the way all the boomers, the railroad barons, the land speculators want to develop the West. And he warns that unless the West drops prior appropriation, that is to say, individual property rights to water that are inflexible, Powell in 1878 says, unless limits were placed on prior appropriation, quote, evils will result therefrom that generations may not be able to correct, and the very men who are now lauded as benefactors in the West will be denounced as oppressors. He appears in 1889 before the Dakota Constitutional Convention, and his advice to the lawmakers who are drafting the constitutions of North and South Dakota is this. If you fail in making a constitution in any other respect, fail not in this one. Fix it in your constitution that no corporation, no body of men, no capital can get possession and rights to your waters. Such a provision will prevent your agricultural resources from falling into the hands of a few, meaning those who get control of the water will get control of the land. That's what he was fearful of. Well, he never, as I'll show you some slides here in a minute, he did not anticipate the great dams that would later be built, and actually he underestimated the water supply of the West. But he had a basic point, and the basic point was that when irrigation finally came to the West, it was captured by large land and water companies, just as he had predicted in 1878. And the problem was, you didn't have any bureaus or administrations to sort out these rights, and so all water rights disputes along streams went into the courts. And when they went to the courts, judges had no way of determining, because there are no state bureaucracies. The first is established in California in the 1880s, but state bureaucracies to keep track of water rights were well in the future for most states into the 20th century. So when people came into court wanting to know what their right to a stream was, judges tended to grant water, quote, to the extent heretofore used, or make awards without considering how many acres a farmer irrigated or what kind of crops he raised. You know, there's a difference between whether you're raising alfalfa or fruit in terms of the amount of irrigation. A 1900 survey of California water by the U.S. Department of Agriculture found that in the San Joaquin River, which is the major river that flows up to the delta where it meets the Sacramento River flowing from the north, the San Joaquin River had been claimed 172 times over. And this was true of almost every smaller stream in California. In the Honey Lake Valley, north of Lake Tahoe, you've never heard of this river probably. It's fed by the Susan River. By 1900, so much water had been claimed in the Susan River, at least on paper, that water supply would have irrigated 230 million acres, meaning over twice the total size of California, more than all the irrigated land in the American West today by far. Few of those Honey Lake Valley claims were in record books, which means that people had to go back to the courts over and over again to try to maintain peace. Henry Miller, the great cattle baron who some of you have heard of, owned huge ranches in the San Joaquin Valley. His ranches covered over 700,000 acres in California and about 3 million acres in California, Nevada, and Oregon. Estimated that he had spent at least 25% of his vast fortune on fighting water rights cases in the courts. And there is no question that this cost of, first of all, providing water to the land, and secondly, litigating the rights to that water to the land, drove up the case of farming and made it very, very difficult for any family farms or the concept of the yeoman farmer to be brought into California. So long before you get the agribusiness of today in California, you started to get this monopoly, in part because of prior appropriation. Well, I want to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so. There were attempts to mitigate prior appropriation. One was the so-called Wright Act of 1887, by which, because in 1886, the Supreme Court of California ruled in a definitive case, Lux v. Hagen, that both prior appropriation and riparian rights pertained in California. Only prior appropriation could pertain on government land. Riparian rights was on private land. We won't get into that too deeply here. If you have a question about it, perhaps we can talk about it further. They had tried in the 1870s in California to establish a state system. A number of people said the only way to make sense of water rights in the West is condemn the rights and lease the water either through county-based commissions or a state commission. But remember, this was the United States, and in commenting on a bill such as this for the state to take control of the water supply, a Sacramento newspaper in 1874 said that a bill to do this was admirably suited to a paternal government like France under Napoleon, but it's entirely contrary to the spirit of both our people and our government. So after the Supreme Court says both that California is going to be a dual riparian rights, prior appropriation regime, the legislature passes this Right Act. It allows irrigation districts, this is the theory, it allows irrigation districts to be created which can then condemn water rights and establish their own water rights regime within those district boundaries. It's a total failure, both because of the agricultural depression of the 1890s and because a number of people in the districts did not want to be included. This fails, and of course, prior appropriation continues in California. What eventually happens to the irrigation districts, here is where they were. Most were down in the San Joaquin Valley, covering, I think there were 49 of them, and they covered a couple million acres. But they were boondoggles. They were speculative schemes. People came in, issued, because you could issue bonds. Private landowners moved into these built ditches that often didn't even deliver water, and it became one of the great failures in public policy in California. Eventually, of course, what happened in California, there were irrigation districts, but the irrigation districts were quite different. They could not condemn water rights and establish their own district water rights locally. And one man, one vote, which was the basic principle of the irrigation district, became 1 acre, 1 vote, which meant that some of the large corporations that you now know of have heard about in the San Joaquin Valley became dominant. And eventually the sheer cost of irrigation ended irrigation, or didn't end the irrigation district, but it certainly crimped the ability to transport the family farm to California. Now, I am at my conclusion, but I want to show you a couple things here, a couple more images. Now, the government gets into this, of course, because if it can't be done at the state level, this offers an opportunity to government move in. And because of the water rights problem, in part, a lot of other things too, the increasing cost of irrigation, government moves in. This happens to be the first great government ditch under the Reclamation Act of 1902, when the federal government takes over, but unfortunately the federal government has no particular rights to the water because those rights are under state law. This is out in the Nevada desert, the diversion of the Truckee River down into the Carson River. It's about 50 miles from where I live. These ditches were much better than the ditches made by private companies. They tended to be lined with concrete in a lot of places, but that drove up the cost. And again, they promised farmers who came on to government irrigation projects that they'd pay maybe $15 an acre for a water right. The farmers ended up having to pay $80, $90, sometimes over $100 an acre, which means that most of the farmers who went on to these government projects fled. Now, this happens to be Roosevelt Dam, and this was a large dam at the turn of the 20th century. We'll see a bigger dam here in a minute. This is the Minidoka irrigation plant in Idaho, near Rupert, Idaho. And it's very important to see those generators there, because eventually the Bureau of Reclamation bails itself out by selling power to cities and then luring people off to the cities of the American West, Los Angeles, San Diego, and let's see here. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, on the farm, this is how farmers who first moved on to the project, the Minidoka project near Rupert, conditions in which they lived. The lesson here is how you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Prairie. Who wants to live under those conditions if you can go to the city and get a better job? Main Street, Rupert, Idaho. It doesn't exactly inspire you with any warm feelings about that town. And then finally, this is Shasta Dam. The high dam era, of course, later changes things entirely, because so much water can be captured, like Hoover Dam captures a year and a half or 2 years flow of the Colorado River. John Wesley Powell had said the West will always be a grazing land because we'll only have water to be able to irrigate land along the streams. It's Shasta Dam, Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam that changed that image. But when I was putting this together, and this is my concluding thought, I was going to talk about community ditch systems in the West to give you some idea that there have been other alternatives under Hispanic law. But I want to mention a story of today and link this today. Treating water as a commodity, then, my conclusion, raised profound moral questions in the 1850s, in the 1880s, and it still does today. There are in Nevada 2 pending federal lawsuits to prevent the city of Las Vegas, in place of the water companies of the 19th century, you have the cities of the 20th century that are the real monopolist of water in many parts of the West. You have 2 federal lawsuits pending in the state of Nevada today to prevent the city of Las Vegas from building a massive 263-mile-long pipeline from White Pine County in the north of Nevada along Highway 50, if you've ever been there. Ely is the county seat along Highway 50 at a cost of $15.5 billion. It's expected to take decades to construct, and it would tap the water from 5 valleys in eastern Nevada. The pipeline would have a profound effect on groundwater, on surface water, on local industries. For example, it would virtually destroy many native species like sage grouse, and it would perhaps, many fear, prevent local farmers, local ranchers from expanding their dairy herds, all to incorporate this beautiful land, and it is, if it's not far from Great Basin National Park, if you've ever been there, to prevent this land from being absorbed into Greater Las Vegas. Greater Las Vegas has a population of 1.9 million, far and away the largest town in Nevada. Reno is a few 100,000. Las Vegas, nearly 2 million people. White Pine County has about 10,000 people. Now the question here is, does Las Vegas have the right to kill off communities in northern Nevada, even if local residents are willing to sell their water rights to Las Vegas? It's a very good question. This has surprising similarities to the Owens Valley controversy. You'll remember back at the turn of the 20th century, by which Los Angeles moved into that valley, bought up the water rights, and then dried up the valley and transported the water to Los Angeles. That was before Los Angeles tapped the Colorado River, too. This isn't an isolated case. This happens in many parts of the West, and I think shows the danger of treating water solely as a commodity. But my last point, there's a big question. Well, Pisani, what would you suggest that would have worked better? And that's a very good question. I don't know. The wonderful thing about being a historian is that you can point to things in the past that you don't like or think might have been better, and you don't really have to propose answers to this. But I do know that a valuable resource was given away for nothing because of mining in California, and that principle was later extended throughout the West. That once the water was gone, it couldn't be recaptured, even if it was needed for a clear public use, like those irrigation districts that were trying to establish local laws that made sense to the people who lived in those districts. And that without regulation, the resource was used in ways that caused untold damage to the environment. So I think, maybe to put it in a nutshell at the end, too much government is clearly a curse, but too little can be dangerous too. So let's see, I think that. Now, I hope I didn't run too far over, but do we have time for just a couple questions? Okay. Doesn't have to be a question, it can be an observation.
I have a question about the Chickasaws in Oklahoma, and they're owning Sardis Lake water. And the city of Oklahoma, the city is trying to take that in negotiations. Could it be, from what you said, if they lose their water rights, that they could also lose control of their land? Of their land. Sardis Lake is on Chickasaw land.
Well, Oklahoma, you know, is a very, very special.
Microphone.
I always thought that my students I always thought that I had a loud enough voice, but this is such a big room. To be honest, I don't know. What is different is, of course, Indian water rights in Oklahoma are different from places that you have reservations, as would be the case in New Mexico. So I can't hazard a guess to that, to be honest with you. Oklahoma is so complicated because the land is owned, but it is not part of a reservation. So my understanding is that Winter's Doctrine rights from the 1908 Supreme Court case would not apply in the same way they would in other parts of the West. So I'm sorry. I learned late in life that as a historian, it's okay to say you don't know the answer to something, and I'm trying to. Any other questions or observations? I know we covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate your patience. I know we covered a lot of ground, and thank you for your patience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And so now, if we can, you guys probably got a chance to watch lunch being brought in. So we'll go ahead and take our lunch break. And if we can, we'll reconvene and start again with our next speaker at about 12:45. So refreshments over here, lunch over here on the left. Don't forget, if you haven't entered to win, a rain barrel. Thank you.